Hey everyone, welcome to Storytime with Miss Desiree. Today I'd like to share a very special book with you. It's called The Nutcracker. Today we will be reading part 1 of The Nutcracker. Introduction. Have you ever loved a toy so much you wished it came to life? Did you dream of the exciting adventures you would have with your special friend? If so, you are not the only one. Nearly 200 years ago, in 1850, the German writer E.T.A. Hoffmann wrote a story called The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, telling how a little girl's love brought to life her cherished nutcracker, an enchanted Christmas gift from her mysterious godfather. The tale charmed readers of all ages, including the French writer Alexandre Dumas, who published a retelling of the story in 1847. From that adaptation, the Russian composer Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky and the choreographer Lev Ivanov created their ballet, The Nutcracker. First performed in St. Petersburg in 1892, it is now a classic performed throughout the world every holiday season. Why has the Nutcracker remained so popular? As the story itself explains, if you love something very much, it is always alive. Pure love of this extraordinary story has kept the words alive for nearly 200 years, so they can dance for you across these colorful pages. Chapter 1. It had been snowing all day, and the great city of Frankfurt was transformed. From her bedroom window, Maria Stahlbaum watched the white flakes falling across the chimneys and tiled roofs, whirling against dark windows and laying a thick carpet down every street and alley. The wind was rising, frequently blowing the snow layers so dense as to hide the houses opposite. Then the layers would open, and you could see every lintel and corner growing bigger with the snow. Presently, lamps were lighted in the windows next door, and the bright beams, the driven snowflakes, surged up like a cloud of elfin dancers in ballet dress. Waltzing and following fast behind each other, they moved in a mighty leap straight across the space towards Maria's window. She heard the tinkle of tiny diamonds upon the panes. She saw the fairy-like figures just for a moment before a great blast of wind shook the old house and threw a blanket of snow against the glass. Luckily, Maria thought, the fir tree had been brought to the door that morning, for it was Christmas Eve. The party gifts had all been wrapped, and the good things to eat were prepared or delivered. But how would the guests ever get here through such a storm? There was to be a dance in the big room in the back of the house, and Maria could not bear to miss any of the ladies in their evening dresses. And what of old Papa Drosselmeyer? He was godfather to both Maria and her brother Fritz. Christmas would not be Christmas without Godfather Drosselmeyer. Such a strange old man, so wise and so clever, so severe at times in his black formal clothes, his old-fashioned manners and grave voice. For years he had worn a dark patch over one eye, but the other eye was as staring and sharp as an owl's. And yet Maria and Fritz loved him completely. No one else could tell such exciting stories or bring such a feeling of wonder to every part of the festivities. And his presents were fantastic beyond belief, each one made by himself. It was almost as if he were a magician. Last year he had brought them a toy castle on a hill above a moat, and when you turned a crank, a troop of knights rode up to the gate. Then the drawbridge was lowered, the great door opened, and out came a princess to receive her guests. Before that, one year, there had been a magic theater with 2 scenes from Sleeping Beauty acted out by tiny figures. And other inventions so precious that Father had a special cupboard built to keep them safe behind glass doors. That cupboard, too, stood in the big room downstairs where the Christmas party always took place. Maria unlatched the window and pushed it open against the snow piled on the sill. The icy white powder rushed up into her face, but as she leaned out a little, she could see people with lanterns coming down the street. There were 4 grown-ups and several children. All of them were bundled tight in heavy coats. They looked funny because their feet were almost buried in the soft snow. Beyond them was another group of people. Surely that was her Aunt Lisa in the scarlet greatcoat. All of them were coming towards Maria's house. Soon she and Fritz would be summoned to the big room, and the wonderful Christmas party would begin. Suddenly, Maria felt herself lifted from behind by 2 strong arms. She struggled and kicked backwards and came down in the room with a thud. She had scooped up a fistful of snow, and now she held it menacingly towards her brother Fritz. He was always playing tricks like that, but he let her go to dodge a snowball, which broke on the carpet behind them. "Ria," he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Kretschmas have come, and Mr. and Mrs. Krone with all their children, and the whole Zimmerman family. Come down the back stairs. You can see the grown-ups trimming the tree through the keyhole of the side door. The tree is the best we've ever had, and I think they have a real cannon, and you have a doll with a big mustache." "You're making that up. No doll has a mustache. This one does, and a blade, and a blue hat with a plume. It's a man doll, I guess. And I think he has a long sword. He must be a general." "You're crazy. Who heard of a general doll?" "I saw it," Fritz said, "and at any rate, there is a table loaded with food, chocolate cake, ginger cookies, and heaps of peppermint stripes and all-colored bonbons. Come on." "Has Godfather come?" "Godfather never comes at the beginning. Don't you remember?" "But will he come through the storm? He's so old and wrinkled. And then he has only one good eye." "He'll come all right, with some crazy present that has to be kept locked up. The snow won't keep him away. You know, I think he can fly like an owl and see in the dark. How he scares me sometimes. I'll bet he could fly right through the window. Look out! Here he comes!" "Whoo! Whoo!" The blizzard shrieked against the window pane. A chunk of solid snow dropped in unexpectedly from the roof like a white owl upon the ledge outside. Fritz ran and locked the window tight. Then he grabbed his sister's hand, and the children rushed laughing out of the room. A mouse scurried out of sight as Maria and Fritz hurried down the hall. Dr. Stahlbaum's house was old and huge, and there was a number of mice in the walls, but he was too kind-hearted to trap them. Fritz did not mind them at all, but ever since Maria had seen one running off with a little rug from her doll house, she did not like them. They were big, blackish mice too, and having such kind-hearted people to live with had made them very bold. Sometimes at night, most often when the moon was shining, Maria would be awakened by a faint but persistent crunch, crunch of a mouse gnawing a hole in the wall behind her bureau. There was a broad, steep stairway going down to the family rooms on the floors below. On the ground floor, running out like a wing into the garden, was the largest room in the house. It was a kind of drawing room and a playroom combined. You could reach it through the main hall, and you could also reach it by way of the back stairs, which was the way Fritz and Maria now took. When this house was built long ago, doors often had keyholes as big as your middle finger, and since this door was a double one, the keyhole was extra large. At first, as Maria looked, everything was blurred by people moving back and forth as busy as squirrels, each one adding some bit to the preparations. The carpet had been rolled back for dancing. Along the right side was a long table spread with platters and raised dishes of all kinds of food. Behind and above the people, in front of one window, as nearly as tall, rose the Christmas tree. Its dark and beautiful branches curved out into the room, layer above layer, adorned with marvelous little toys, with fairy tale angels and birds, with flowers of spun glass, and with amusing cotton kittens and gnomes and animals of all kinds, so many that you could not possibly count them. And in much the same way that snow might lie on the fir tree in the forest, a frosting of silver tinsel dropped from bough to bough in even curves, growing smaller as the tree narrowed upward. Near the top was a figure of Father Christmas, and at the very top a star. "Isn't the tree wonderful?" Maria exclaimed. Clara and Carl were only two of several cousins who had come to the Christmas Eve party here, but they also knew about the side door to the great room, and now came running in upon Fritz and Maria. "Merry Christmas," they called. "Oh, you're peeking! Let me look! Let me look!" And pushing and shoving, as over-hasty people do, they all tried to look through the keyhole, no one having enough time to catch more than a blurred image before another child was very close upon him, trying to see, and finally all of them falling on top of one another in a mad scramble of giggles and acrobatics. They would have rolled in a heap right into the room had the door been suddenly opened. Just then the clock struck 7, and the children heard Mrs. Stallbaum calling, "Children, Father Christmas has come." They had just managed to disentangle themselves and to stand up and smooth out their party clothes when the doors were thrown open wide. Maria's mother stood inside with her arms extended. "Merry Christmas, my darling," she said. "The tree has been lighted." Its glow and its fragrance filled the room. At the top of the tree the stars shone. Every ornament twinkled. "Merry Christmas," the children said softly. Chapter 2. It was the custom for the children to have a little dance first, and then for the grown-ups to have a waltz, and then for the young and old to dance together. Between dances they had glasses of punch, and Maria helped her mother pass the little cups around. She did not see Godfather Drosselmeyer. She kept looking, too, for the strange man doll that Fritz had described, but there was nothing like that among her many presents. And now she was far too busy passing the cold meat and sandwiches and little cakes to think about her gift. But quite suddenly, as she offered a slice of cake to old Mrs. Gumple, who was sitting next to the tree, Maria saw the most remarkable thing. Fritz had been telling the truth. Standing stiffly on a little table, as if at attention, was a little soldier. He wore highly polished boots, red trousers, a blue stripe, and a white vest crossed by 2 bands of crimson, a deep blue general's coat, and an impressive hat with a plume. He must be made out of some kind of metal, Maria thought, for he looked so sturdy and strong. He had a high arched nose, a jutting chin, and a round and brave-looking eyes. A rather extra large mustache grew from his upper lip. He held a long sword at his left side, and his eyes had such trusting and noble expression, brave and gentle at the same time, that Maria lost her heart to him at once. "Why, he's like a little prince," she thought. The soldiers looked up at her steadily. His painted eyelashes gave him a very alert and appealing expression, like a big doll begging for a piece of your cake. How could anyone resist him? He made you feel protective and brave yourself. Thank you, child, she heard Mrs. Gumble saying. The almond torte is delicious. The clock struck again, and as it did, so the door to the big hall opened slowly, and there stood Godfather Drosselmeyer. He was dressed all in black, with a gold chain around his neck. His white cravat and his hair, like spun silver, made the black suit look very somber. He always wore a black patch over his left eye, but his other eye was so bright and piercing that it well served him for two. His usual white face was flushed with a rosy glow from the snowy night. When he came forward, he was followed by two tiny little men servants, each carrying a Christmas package nearly as big as a big boy. No one had seen such large packages before. When the greetings were over, the two servants untied and opened the packages. Out of one of the boxes, they took a huge cabbage. Out of the other, a very pink cake. Everyone crowded around in astonishment and curiosity. The servants then lifted the cabbage and the cake, and underneath each was a doll nearly 3 feet tall and almost real-looking. They were dressed as a shepherd and shepherdess. Then they seemed to come alive. The dolls rose and bowed to the audience and then to each other, and executed a most graceful and charming dance. They ended by bowing low and sitting again in the position ready for the green cabbage and the pink cake to cover them. Everyone was delighted and charmed by the performance. When they had vanished under their covers, Godfather Drosselmeyer came over to Maria and Fritz. He kissed each one of them and said, "My dear godchildren, these creations were made for you. They have come to wish you a happy Christmas, to give you old Drosselmeyer's love." "Thank you, Godfather," they said together, "and Merry Christmas to you." Drosselmeyer took Maria's hand affectionately. "I sent you and Fritz another little gift," he said. "Have you seen it?" "No?" "Well, look here." He went across toward the tree, past old Mrs. Gumble, who was still munching sweet cakes, and picked up the brave iron soldier. "Oh, I love him, Godfather!" Maria cried. He is a nutcracker," said Papa Drosselmeyer. "Look, his jaws are so strong that he can crack the hardest nut without hurting his teeth at all." Papa Drosselmeyer held the soldier with one hand, and with his other raised the soldier's long sword backward. As he did so, the mouth opened wide, revealing 2 rows of very white teeth. Then Drosselmeyer placed a large walnut in the nutcracker's mouth, pressed down the sword, and the jaw closed, cracking the shell into 4 even pieces. He handed the cracked nut to Maria. Then he tried a hazelnut, an almond, and a Brazil nut, each time giving the open nut to one little girl or another. The boys, too, had crowded around to see this curious fellow. But Fritz was not much impressed. "Didn't I tell you, Maria?" he said. "Now you have a doll with a big black mustache." "He's not a doll. He's a nutcracker." "What's so magic about him?" Fritz asked. He had never seen a nutcracker shaped like a soldier, but he had seen silver ones and wooden ones with springs. "Let me have him," he demanded. "I bet he can't crack every nut." "No, you'll hurt him." "Godfather, please don't give Nutcracker to Fritz." "But I bought him for both of you, my dear. There, Fritz, and be careful. He'll crack your nuts for years, but you must not abuse him." Thereupon Godfather Drosselmeyer turned away to speak with some older friends. Fritz held the little soldier high in the air and started putting nuts in his mouth and crushing them, one right after another. Crack, 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 crack went the little jaws, and nut after nut fell out perfectly, bitten into 4 pieces. Then Fritz became annoyed and took an exceptionally large, heavy hickory nut, the toughest he could find, and pushed it far back into the soldier's mouth. Crack, crack, crack! Fritz banged the sword up and down. The nut fell out as its shell broken in 4 pieces. but there was a loose, clanking sound. The little mouth fell open again, though no one had lifted the sword. Nutcracker was badly hurt. "Fritz, you did that on purpose! You hurt him on purpose! How unhappy he looks now!" Maria was dreadfully upset. Fritz laughed to cover his shame and turned away. But Maria took Nutcracker up in her arms and tried again and again to get his lower jaw into position, for Nutcracker seemed more real to her than did any of her dolls, and she felt certain he was in pain. What would she do now? Papa Drosselmeyer had been watching her from across the room. He came over and shook his head. Gently he took up Nutcracker and tried to set the broken jaw, but it was no use. "He's badly hurt, Maria," he said, "but perhaps we can heal the wound in time. Let us bandage it well and give him some rest." Taking a large linen handkerchief from his coat pocket, Drosselmeyer bound it firmly around the jaw, holding it in position as he did so. With love and good care he should recover. Now put him down and let's enjoy the rest of the party. It was just the right size for Nutcracker. Gently she made him comfortable in the bed, and she was not at all surprised when his eyes closed as she laid him down. He had no fever, she could tell. He could sleep now in the morning, and in the morning she would come to look after him and bring him some nourishment. Meanwhile, the party had become very merry. People were laughing, talking happily. Coming back from the cupboard, Maria saw the presents had just been given. For each girl, a handsomely dressed doll with a doll's blanket and pillow. For each boy, a little rifle and either a drum or a fife. Soon the girls were rocking their new babies in their arms, and the boys, led by Fritz, formed into the platoon of well-drilled troops and went parading back and forth across the room. Shrill fifes pierced the air. Drum rolls thundered all over all conversation. On they came in full battle array, and suddenly, making a left march, they plunged head-on into the group of girls with their dolls. Maria started scolding Fritz, and in 2 minutes there was more noise in the room than a wild storm outside. At length, Fritz's father could tolerate it no longer. Stop it, he cried. "This is a party for everyone, not just for boys and girls. Come, all of you, and take partners. We need another dance." Aunt Lisa sat at the square piano, and soon they were all off on a lively polka. It was great fun, and had to be followed by an easier waltz. Then the ices and the rich mocha cakes were served, with hot chocolate for the children. Some of the grown people had wine, and they offered toasts to each other and to Christmas itself. They stood in front of the tree and sang the carol of Christmas night. And then it was time to be going. Old Mrs. Grumple had already started nodding, and several boys were struggling to keep from yawning. The warm room, the rich food, and the dancing had made everyone tired. So into the winter wraps and out into the snowy night they went, with such fond farewells that you would have thought there was no time so wonderful as Christmas time, and you would have been right. The last to come was the last to leave. Long after the children were in their beds, Mother and Father stood in the front hall saying good night to the lingering guests. It was getting chilly from the constant opening of the outer door. Only when everyone else had gone did Godfather Drosselmeyer appear at the far end of the hall, not from the cloakroom, although he was covered in shoulders to shoes in an immense gray fur coat. There was a crafty glint in his eye and a smile on his face. "Well, you have made an old man feel young again," Papa Drosselmeyer said to his hosts. "What a splendid and joyous party! I have not spent a more enjoyable evening in many years. Truly a spell was put upon this house tonight." He shook hands with Dr. Stallborn, put his tall fur hat on, and stood up on to the top step. The snowstorm swirled down around him, and he seemed to vanish into it like a wizard. Days later, a maid who had come back into the empty party room That night, to tidy up a bit after all the guests had gone, said she had been badly frightened by finding an old man there in the corner, bending over a doll's bed. He had a slender, shining object in one hand, like a medicine dropper or a small screwdriver. When she called out to him, he just raised one finger to his lips and made the sign of silence. In the dim room, the maid was too startled to know if it was one of the guests. She thought it could not possibly be. Chapter 3. Crunch, crunch, crunch. There was that sound in the wall again. Maria sat up in bed, holding the quilt around her. How cold it was. She leaned from her bed to look at the sky. The snow had stopped falling and the moon had come out. She could see it glinting on the tiny tinsel wrapper of a candy on her bed table. She had brought it up for a good night's snack and had been too sleepy to eat it. She felt wide awake now, though she could not have slept very long, for it was deep night. Crunch, crunch. They were louder than ever. Were they bigger mice, or were there more of them? She thought about the Christmas tree and of Nutcracker lying in his little bed with its thin cover. She wished she had brought him up here. Surely she should have given him more covers, for the party room would be bitterly cold by now. Maria slid out of bed and into her slippers and wrapper. Then, when she lighted her bedside candle lamp, the sound in the walls stopped abruptly. She opened the door quietly and went down the long, dark halls towards the stairs. Maria's velvet slippers muffled her steps. The stairs were carpeted and firm, and she went down them in complete silence. Even going into the big room made no sound, for the door was ajar and she could pass through. Most of the room lay in shadow. Her candle beam lighted only a narrow strip of the floor. As she came in, it followed across the wall up the tall owl clock. It picked out the dial, and then both golden hands pointed together the owl's head on top. The owl stirred and opened its eyes, and at that very instant the clock spoke a loud and deep hollow "Ooh, ooh, ooh," that echoed from the wall to the wall. The owl raised itself up and began beating its wings. The clock struck again and again as Maria went into the toy cupboard. In front of it was a doll's bed, and there was Nutcracker sound asleep. To her great joy, his mouth was peacefully closed, and the bandage had slipped off. He would get well. She started to take him up in her arms, and there, that sound faintly, crunch, crunch, cranchity crunch. The sound came again, closer and louder. Cranch, cranch. It was followed by the rattle of a tiny running feet. A mouse's face appeared under the Christmas tree and vanished. Then another one, much nearer. Oh, that big and ugly mouse! He seemed to be getting larger and coming straight for Maria. At this moment her candle went out. A score of wicked little mice eyes danced around the room. Terrified, Maria threw herself on the sofa and buried her face in the pillows. When she looked out again, there was a strange dim light all over the room. She could not tell where it came from. Mice, large, fat, nearly black mice, with long and stringy tails, were moving back and forth in a kind of planned activity, as if following orders. They had sharp little knives like swords, and they were assembling on the side of the room opposite the toy cupboard. Then Maria noticed the strangest thing. The mice in the sofa and the table and chairs were getting larger and larger. The Christmas tree boughs had reached out into the room, and the needles were growing much longer, and all of the ornaments blowing out like balloons, but keeping their various forms. The tinsel garlands were thick ropes of silver and gold. The doll's bed and the Nutcracker in it were becoming nearly life-size. The room itself was expanding. Or was Maria growing smaller and smaller? She felt the sofa rising beneath her. The seat was already about 6 feet from the floor. She had better get off right away. She slid down the carved leg and touched the floor just a few feet from her doll's bed, which was now roomy enough for Maria herself. Nutcracker was gone! The room was in a great commotion. The mice, as large and as big dogs, were crowding together across the room, lining up in regular rows. One of them gave a high shriek, flourished his knife, and the whole band came charging towards the cupboard. Their wiry black feet made that scratchy sound Maria knew so well. In another second the mice would have been upon her, but a bugle sounded and the cupboard door opened, and a troop of wooden soldiers as large as the mice rushed out to engage them. Cannons were wheeled into position, and a ball after ball, red, pink, white, and blue, was sent in showers against the mice. But how strangely soft they were, more like big gumdrops. They seemed to only bounce off the fat mice's fur. The bugle sounded again. A noble figure suddenly appeared at the head of the troops, in red trousers, blue coat, and plumed headdress. It was Nutcracker. He had drawn his sword. He turned halfway around to the first line of troops, gave a command, and led them straight into the front ranks of the mousy army. What a fierce hand-to-hand combat followed. The soldiers stood there bravely, but in their tin swords were no match for the knives and sharp teeth of the mice. Crunch! Crunch! The sound of the mouse battle cry. Nutcracker signaled again, and the second line of soldiers ran into the fight. Pausing a few feet from their huddled foes, they fell to their knees and took aim with their rifles. The savage mouse horde came on them, eyes and teeth flashing. The riflemen fired. Their courage was not matched by arms of sufficient power, and the shots only tickled the tough skins of the mice. One or two squealed in pain. The rest were only made more angry. Nutcracker now summoned his last defenses. The third rank came on at a run, guns lowered and sharp steel bayonets thrust forward. The mouse villains did not move and were about to be pierced